Hey everyone, the name is Kris Barocsi. Welcome to a new episode of Guitar Myth Busting. Today we're going to be talking about power amp tubes. If they really matter, if they don't matter at all, if the guitar amp industry just made us believe that the power amp tube type is gonna be the one that defines the amp or whatever the truth is. I know that there are many videos out there which will show how power amp tubes don't matter at all, or preamp tubes, or whichever tubes, and they all sound the same and everything is, it's just a lie. There's an issue with most of these videos though, because it really does matter what kind of amp you are doing the shootout with. And I'll talk about that in a second. That is actually a very important piece of this puzzle. But before we do that, the tubes I'm going to be testing today: an EL34, a 6L6, 6V6, KT66, and KD88. These are really easy to swap because they have the same socket, and all those will work with this amp. More about it later. But first, let's do the blindfold test. I obviously took care of all the variables. I eliminated everything that was possible, so I am using the same amp with the same settings. I am using the same SM7B mic in front with the same preamp settings, didn't change anything. Then the guitar is obviously the same, and I have a looper even. I looped in this little playing, like two little playing parts, and I go through the power amp tubes with the looper, so I eliminate the player's inconsistencies as well. Let's do that first. I highly recommend using headphones or at least earbuds or something, because obviously those differences, if you hear anything at all even, are really, really small. So the first myth that needs to be sort of busted or talked about is that power amp tubes will not change the amp. It will still sound like the same amp. What could happen, depending on the amp type, is that you'll have a different fine tuning. That's what power amp tubes really do, at least in my opinion, and in those amp builders' opinions who I was talking about over the years about the importance of tube types and all those things. We're talking about fine tuning the harmonic content, fine tuning the low end, the response of the mid range, etc. It's little things. So at this point, I think it's safe to say that if you do not care about the details, you're happy with the tone, whatever, just don't bother. If you like what you have, you're probably as happy as you could be. So it's not worth the trouble. Let's not blow this up and make this too important, right? Because it really isn't. Unless you have something like an amp like this, which is the Tube Workshop Single 6. It's a single-ended, single power amp tube amp. It's a 6-watt amp and it needs only one tube, so you don't need to bias anything. You can just literally swap the power amp tubes that will fit its socket. That's exactly why I have these 5 tubes here. These all just literally go in and you can turn on the amp and and go for it. I know how people react to comparisons where the variables are there and sort of influence the experience of the listener. So I stick to the looper this time because I never done that before, and I felt like, hey, let's try that out. It also proves a point, because if the player does not react to the amp, you just have a loop on, and whatever changes, the loop will just literally do the same thing and will not adjust dynamics or play or pick differently. That eliminates a lot of the actual differences that a power amp tube could do. And that's one of the points that needs to be made. If a player hears that an amp breaks up more, automatically plays differently. Right? It will adjust its picking dynamics or the way the notes are fretted, etc. And that is what makes the biggest difference when we're talking about swapping power amp tubes. And now, before I tell you what my experience was playing this amp with different power amp tubes, I want to show you the same recording, the blindfold test again, this time not blindfolded though. So it's going to be the same order of the clips, the same order of the tubes obviously, and you'll see on screen which tube is plugged in. Now I want to share my thoughts on this whole subject. First of all, because we just heard the clips one after each other, the player's experience. So when I tested this amp with the different tubes, I felt a bigger difference. Like, it really felt very different with the KD66. That was my favorite out of all these tubes, and it felt bigger, more headroom, or just clearer. Had a really nice sparkle, not harsh, a bit mellower, but somehow really open sounding. Like, I really loved everything about the KT66 most. The 6L6 is just wonderful. It's perfect. I loved the EL34 for the more mid-rangey sort of more compact tone that I got, and the 6V6 just had a nice sweetness to it, not really radical in any direction, not super loud, not super quiet, just had a really sweet tone. I love amps. Most of my favorite amps have actually 6V6 tubes, which is interesting, but that was not my favorite with this amp. And now let's talk about the amp type, where it even makes sense to think about swapping power amp tubes. It's gonna be a simple amp which is mostly not like a modern design, because most modern amps have so much happening in the preamp section that is what defines its tone. Amps where the power amp is not supposed to distort, is not supposed to define the player's experience as much as the preamp does, because that's where most of the distortion happens. That's where all the EQ changes happen and all the harmonics come into play, etc. Like, the preamp is much more important in those amps. So if you swap the power amp tubes, there's a good chance you will hear or feel absolutely nothing. I'm not saying it's like that, but I can definitely tell that most people's experience is gonna be like, what? Tubes are just one component or one type of component in an amplifier. The more complex an amplifier design is, the less important certain parts of the circuit are. That's because tubes are important in an amp, but they are not what make an amp sound a certain way. They will fine-tune stuff. And if the amp design of the amplifier, where you swap tubes, is simple with the least amount of components, and the main goal for that amplifier was to keep everything as honest as possible, no crazy EQ stuff happening in the preamp, no incredible amount of parts built in the circuit, that's where you will hear anything, if even. So that's I think a very important part of the puzzle. Tone is not in the tubes, and tone is not in the whatever pots or the whichever parts of an amplifier. It's the whole circuit is what defines the tone, and if you change the tube in a simple circuit, that's going to make a bigger difference than if you change the same type of power amp tubes in a very complex circuit. And to sum up this comparison, what I did today, I honestly would be really happy with any of those tubes, and I wouldn't mind having any of those in the amp. And to some extent, I think it would be really hard to spot the tube. Like if something was in it right now, turned it on, started playing, except for the KD88, I think I could tell that. But for the others, I would just say I really like what I'm hearing and I'm happy and let's move on. So it's not like power amp tubes are gonna change everything. Not at all. I think whoever says that, overreacts a little bit. But saying that power amp tubes don't matter at all and we've been lied to, that's a bit of an oversimplifying and a bit, I wouldn't say arrogant, but not really covering the whole subject. It much more just literally focuses on one experience or one type of experience using complex amps, swapping tubes and not hearing a difference, or whatever it is. It's a complex subject, and it is very subjective, of course, too. Most people just don't care about these small differences, which is perfectly fine, and then you should not worry about them. All right, let me know what you think about this whole subject, and if you guessed the tubes right in the first blindfold comparison round in the comments below. See you in the next video. Bye bye.